The wind came from the north at 30 below zero, and it carried the smell of gunpowder and frozen blood across the Imjin River valley like a message nobody wanted to receive. The bridge was still standing. 400 Chinese soldiers were moving toward it in the dark, and the only American left on it was already bleeding. That is where this story begins. Not with a medal ceremony or a press release or a general shaking hands in front of a camera. It begins in the middle of a bridge, in the middle of a war that most Americans back home could not find on a map, with a man named Corporal James Whitfield crouched over a detonator box with frozen fingers, and the certain knowledge that if he did not blow the bridge in the next 90 seconds, 400 enemy soldiers were going to pour across it and into the rear flank of an American battalion that had already taken 40% casualties that night. He knew what pressing that detonator meant. He pressed it anyway. To understand what happened on that bridge, you have to understand what the Korean War actually was. Not the sanitized version that gets wedged between World War II and Vietnam in history books, but the raw and punishing reality of what American soldiers encountered when they deployed to the Korean Peninsula in the summer of 1950 and found themselves fighting a war that the United States Army was almost completely unprepared to fight. The army that landed in Korea was in many ways a peacetime army, garrison-soft and under-equipped, built on the assumption that the next major conflict would look like the last one, with clear front lines and identifiable objectives, and an enemy that behaved the way European armies had behaved. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army did not behave that way. They never did. The Chinese entered the Korean War officially in October of 1950, though elements of their forces had been filtering across the Yalu River for weeks before that, moving only at night, hiding during the day under canvas and inside the shadows of ridgelines that American reconnaissance aircraft flew over without seeing anything. General Douglas MacArthur had been warned. His intelligence officers had been warning him for weeks that the Chinese were massing on the border, that the movement south was not a bluff, that the People's Liberation Army was capable of putting hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the field on very short notice with very little logistical footprint. MacArthur did not believe it, or chose not to believe it, or had convinced himself that the Chinese would not dare confront the United States military, the same military that had just crushed Imperial Japan, the same military that was already moving north toward the Yalu River with the confidence of a force that expected to be home by Christmas. They were not home by Christmas. What happened in late November and early December of 1950 is still studied in military academies as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern warfare. The Chinese struck at night in massive coordinated waves against American and United Nations forces that were strung out in a long column pushing north toward the Chinese border. The temperature at night was dropping to -20, -25, -30 degrees Fahrenheit in some places, and the American soldiers who had been issued inadequate cold weather gear were already fighting the environment before the first Chinese bugle sounded, because the bugles always came first. That was the thing that veterans of that campaign remembered until the day they died. The sound of the bugles in the darkness, high and metallic and completely unlike anything in the American military tradition, signaling the beginning of a human wave assault that the defending positions could hear coming but frequently could not stop. The human wave tactic was not random. It was not the product of Chinese commanders who did not value the lives of their soldiers. It was a calculated operational strategy built around several specific realities of the Korean terrain and the limitations of American firepower at the tactical level. American infantry units in Korea were equipped with weapons that were devastating in a sustained firefight at medium range, but those weapons required functioning mechanical components, and at -30 degrees, mechanical components failed. Rifle bolts froze. Machine gun mechanisms seized. Grenades that should have detonated sometimes did not, because the propellant compounds in the fuses lost effectiveness in extreme cold. The M1 Garand, which was one of the finest infantry rifles ever fielded by any army in any war up to that point, could become an expensive club in cold weather if the soldier carrying it had not taken specific precautions to keep the lubricant from gelling in the action. Many soldiers had not taken those precautions because they had not been told to, or had been told but had not fully understood, or were simply too exhausted and too cold to do anything about it. The Chinese commanders knew this. They planned around it. They timed their attacks for the coldest hours of the night, typically between 2 and 4 in the morning, when human body temperature drops to its lowest point and alertness fades, when American weapons were most likely to malfunction and American soldiers were most likely to be operating in a state of cold-induced physical and cognitive impairment. The waves would come fast. Thousands of soldiers moving across open ground with a momentum that could overwhelm a fixed position before the defenders could establish an effective rate of fire. Some of those soldiers carried rifles, some carried submachine guns. Many carried nothing but their will, and the bodies of the men in front of them as cover. And the goal was not necessarily to shoot every defender, but to get close enough that the volume and mass of the assault made coherent defense impossible. This is the world that Corporal James Whitfield had been living in for 3 weeks when his unit was assigned to hold a bridge crossing on the night of December 4th, 1950. Whitfield was 23 years old. He had enlisted in the Army in 1948, after 2 years of working in a machine shop in Youngstown, Ohio, where he had learned to read mechanical systems the way other men read books, with patience and attention, and an understanding that the difference between a machine that worked and a machine that did not work was almost always the smallest possible detail. That sensibility would save his life. He was not a large man, 5 feet 10 inches and 160 pounds, but he was physically tough in the particular way of men who do heavy manual labor in cold climates. His body adapted to the kind of sustained effort that wears down men who built their strength in warmer and more comfortable circumstances. His service record described him as reliable, mechanically proficient, and calm under pressure. That last quality was the one that mattered most on the night of December 4th. His unit, a rifle company in the 7th Infantry Regiment, had been pulling back southward for 4 days by the time they reached the bridge. The withdrawal from the chosen reservoir area was not a retreat in the way that word is usually understood. It was a fighting withdrawal, which means that every mile of ground given up was paid for again in blood, that the rear guard of the column was in constant contact with Chinese forces pressing from behind, and that the men doing the withdrawing were simultaneously trying to carry their wounded, maintain unit cohesion, keep their weapons functional in temperatures that were trying very hard to kill them even without any Chinese assistance, and make decisions under fire that in any reasonable context would have required hours of planning and staff work. They were doing all of this while starving because the supply lines had been cut and rations had run out 2 days before, and because the canned rations that remained were frozen solid and could not be eaten without first thawing them against body heat, which meant sleeping with cans of food pressed against your stomach, which meant not sleeping really, because sleeping at -30 degrees without adequate shelter was a good way to not wake up. Whitfield had not eaten a real meal in 48 hours when his company commander pulled him aside on the afternoon of December 4th and gave him an assignment that nobody wanted. The bridge over the creek tributary 3 miles south was the last viable crossing point for the column before it reached a secondary road that led to the main supply route south. If the Chinese got across that bridge before the American column reached it, the column would have to fight through them to continue south, and the column was in no condition to fight through anything that required more than minimal effort. The bridge had to stay open long enough for the column to cross, and then it had to come down, hard, fast, without any possibility of it being used by the forces pressing from the north. The demolition charges had already been set by an engineer sergeant who had done competent work but had then been evacuated with a shrapnel wound in his left thigh before he could brief anyone on exactly what he had done. What he had left behind were charges at 3 points on the bridge structure, a detonator box with 2 firing circuits, and a handwritten note in a pocket of his field jacket that was now on its way south on a medevac vehicle and would not be found until 6 days later. The note described a wiring irregularity in the secondary firing circuit that was relevant to understanding how the detonator box would behave when activated. The note was not available to Whitfield. He would figure out the wiring irregularity on his own, under fire in the dark, at -28 degrees, with 400 Chinese soldiers closing from 200 yards. The company set up a defensive perimeter around the bridge in the late afternoon. There were 31 men, including Whitfield, which was roughly a third of what the company should have been at full strength. The other 2/3 were dead, wounded, or separated somewhere in the previous 4 days of withdrawal. 31 men with a collection of weapons in various states of serviceability, 2 light machine guns, of which one was operating at reduced capacity due to a feeding mechanism problem that nobody had been able to fix, and a mortar section with 14 rounds remaining. The company commander, a first lieutenant named Hargrove, who had assumed command after the captain was killed on day 2 of the withdrawal, walked the perimeter in the last hour of grey afternoon light and said very little to the men he passed. There was not much to say. The situation was comprehensible to everyone present. Hold the bridge until the column crosses, then blow it. Try not to die. The column began arriving at the bridge at approximately 7 in the evening. It was already full dark by then, the kind of winter darkness in northern Korea that has a physical weight to it, that presses down on you and makes distances feel uncertain and directions feel unreliable. The temperature had dropped another 4 degrees since sunset. Whitfield was positioned at the north end of the bridge with 4 other men, their specific job being to cover the approach road while the column crossed and to be the last Americans on the bridge before it came down. He had the detonator box with him, positioned behind a low stone wall that provided minimal cover, but was better than nothing. He had familiarized himself with the firing circuits during the last hour of daylight, tracing the wires with his fingers through the stiff work of his gloves, trying to understand what the engineer sergeant had constructed. Most of it was straightforward. The irregularity in the secondary circuit was not immediately obvious, but it was there. A junction that looked correct until you looked at it again and realized the wire gauge was wrong for the load it was supposed to carry. Whitfield noted it and filed it away and said nothing about it to anyone, because there was nothing to be done about it right now, and saying so would only contribute to the anxiety that was already present in sufficient quantities. The column took 2.5 hours to cross. It was the longest 2.5 hours of Whitfield's life up to that point. They came across in groups, some walking under their own power, some being carried, some on vehicles that moved at walking pace because the road surface was ice over frozen mud, and anything faster would put a truck off the bridge railing. The sound of the withdrawal was a low, continuous grinding, boots on wooden planking, engine noise, the occasional clink of equipment, someone crying quietly from pain somewhere in the middle of it all. Nobody spoke above a murmur. The Chinese were out there in the dark, and sound carried in cold air. At 9:40, Lieutenant Hargrove appeared at the north end of the bridge and told Whitfield that the last of the column had crossed, and that it was time. He would take 3 of the 5 men at the north end south across the bridge, and Whitfield would stay with 1 other man, a private named Coleman, to initiate the demolition and then cross on foot. Standard procedure: fire the detonator, confirm the charges have initiated, cross the bridge if the structure is still viable, blow the remaining charges if necessary from the south end. Hargrove asked Whitfield if he understood. Whitfield said he did. Hargrove took 3 men south across the bridge. The wooden planking echoed under their boots. Then the bugles started. They came from the north, from the darkness beyond the approach road, high and insistent and completely without mercy. Whitfield had heard them before during the withdrawal, and he had told himself each time that he would not react to them the way he had the first time, which was with something close to pure animal fear, a biological response to a sound that the human nervous system processes correctly as a signal of incoming mass violence. He did not react with fear this time, or if he did not allow it to become anything other than information. His hands moved to the detonator box. Coleman was at his shoulder, rifle up, looking north into the darkness. The first shapes appeared at the limit of vision 2 minutes after the bugle started, dark against the darker dark, moving fast, spreading wide across the approach road and onto the shoulders of the road on both sides. The characteristic spread of a wave assault designed to maximize frontage and minimize the effectiveness of a fixed defensive position. Whitfield estimated the number at between 300 and 400, which matched the intelligence estimate his company commander had briefed that morning. He did not have time to feel anything meaningful about that number. He squeezed the firing handle on the detonator box. Nothing happened. He squeezed again. Nothing. He looked at the box in the dim light of a quarter moon and understood immediately, with the clarity that comes from having spent 2 years in a machine shop learning to diagnose mechanical failures in real time, that the primary circuit had failed. The connection at the terminal block had shaken loose, probably during the column crossing, when the vibration from the vehicles had transmitted through the stone wall and into the box. It was a 30-second fix under normal conditions. These were not normal conditions. The Chinese were inside 200 yards and moving fast, and Coleman was firing single shots with the deliberate cadence of a man who knows he has a limited magazine and needs to make each round count. Whitfield stripped off his right glove. His fingers hit the air at -28 degrees, and the pain was immediate and serious. The kind of pain that is also a countdown, because exposed flesh at that temperature begins to suffer permanent tissue damage in minutes. He did not have minutes. He found the terminal block by feel, found the loose connection by feel, worked it back into contact, and squeezed the firing handle again. One charge detonated. The one closest to the north end of the bridge, which was essentially where Whitfield was standing. The concussion hit him like a wall, lifted him partially off his feet, and he came back down against the stone wall with his left shoulder taking the impact, and a sound in his ears that was no longer sound, but pressure, a sustained roaring that drowned out everything, including the bugles and Coleman's rifle and the noise of 400 sets of boots on frozen ground. The north section of the bridge sagged. It did not come down. The secondary charge, the one with the wiring irregularity he had noted during his afternoon inspection, had not fired. The bridge was damaged, but it was not down, and the Chinese were inside 100 yards, and the first of them were already reaching the damaged section at the north end, testing it with their weight, finding that it held. Coleman grabbed his arm and said something that Whitfield could not hear through the pressure in his ears. He understood the gesture. They needed to go. The bridge was compromised but crossable, and in 60 seconds there would be Chinese on it, and the opportunity to bring it down completely would be gone. Whitfield looked at the detonator box, looked at the bridge, and made the calculation that he would spend the rest of his life being asked about. The secondary circuit was wired incorrectly for the load. He could rewire it. It would take 4 minutes in a warm room with proper tools and good light. He had no tools, no light, and hands that were already losing fine motor control. He also had the understanding, arrived at through those 2 years in the machine shop and 3 weeks of war, that there was another way. He told Coleman to go. Coleman did not go. Whitfield told him again. Coleman looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than it had any right to, and then ran south across the bridge. Whitfield watched him go for exactly 1 second and then picked up the detonator box and ran north. Not south. North. Toward the Chinese. The secondary charge was set at the midpoint of the bridge. The wiring irregularity meant that the detonator box could not deliver sufficient current to fire it from the terminal connection as designed. But Whitfield had noted during his afternoon inspection that the charge itself was wired with a backup mechanical initiator. A pull-wire friction fuse of the type used when electrical detonation is not available or not trusted, that was taped to the underside of the main charge housing. He had noted it and filed it away. He was retrieving it now. He ran north until he was on the bridge, until the damaged section was under his feet, and he could feel the wrongness in the way the structure moved under his weight. The Chinese were at the north end. The first of them were stepping onto the bridge. He could see them clearly now, dark coats and quilted jackets, and the glint of weapons in the moonlight, and they could see him. And for a moment that has no rational explanation, the shooting stopped, both sides, as if the situation required a moment of mutual comprehension before it proceeded to its conclusion. Whitfield went to one knee on the bridge deck and reached under the railing and found the charge housing by feel, and found the pull wire. The mechanical initiator on that type of fuse had a 4-second delay after activation. He understood this. He pulled the wire. He ran. He ran south on a bridge that was shaking under the weight of men coming from the north, that was sagging where the first charge had damaged the support structure, that was becoming increasingly uncertain under his feet with every step. He heard shots behind him. He felt something strike his left arm above the elbow, not the impact of a bullet at velocity, but the slap of a ricochet or a fragment, something that told him the shooting had resumed. He did not stop. He was at the south end of the bridge when the secondary charge detonated. The bridge came down, not all of it, not cleanly, but the midpoint section dropped into the creek 20 feet below and took approximately 60 feet of structure with it, and the men who had been on that section of the bridge went with it into the frozen creek, and the men who had been behind them on the north end were stopped by the gap, a gap that was too wide to jump and too cold to swim, and separated them from the south bank by a distance that was, for the moment, tactically absolute. Whitfield was on the south bank. He had burns on his right hand from the exposed grip on the detonator terminal work, frostbite developing in 3 fingers of the same hand, a shrapnel or ricochet wound in his left arm that had not hit bone but was bleeding steadily through his field jacket, a concussion from the first detonation that would not be formally diagnosed for another 4 days, and a left shoulder bruised deep enough to affect his range of motion for 6 weeks. He was standing in the snow on the south bank of a creek in North Korea at -28 degrees, and the bridge was down and the Chinese were on the other side of it. Coleman was there. He had not gone all the way south. He had stopped 50 yards past the bridge and waited, which was either a violation of a direct order or the decision of a man who understood that some orders are given in circumstances where they should not be followed. Whitfield did not address this. Coleman looked at him and said, "You are on fire," and Whitfield looked at his left sleeve and saw that a fragment of something, wood or metal from the demolition, had ignited the fabric of his field jacket, and it was burning with a small, determined flame. He put it out with his right hand, which was already damaged, and the pain of that action was significant, and he noted it and set it aside. Lieutenant Hargrove was there too, with the 3 men he had taken south across the bridge 40 minutes earlier. Hargrove looked at the gap in the bridge structure and at Whitfield and said something about the timing, something that acknowledged the fact that the bridge had come down later than it should have, and that the Chinese had gotten onto it before it detonated. Whitfield said, "Yes, sir." Hargrove said, "How many did we lose on the bridge?" Whitfield said he did not know. He had not been counting. He had been running. The unit moved south. They rejoined the main column 2 miles further on, and Whitfield was examined by a corpsman who confirmed the frostbite in 3 fingers and the wound in his arm, and recommended evacuation, which Whitfield declined, and the corpsman noted this in his treatment record and moved on because there were 20 other men who needed attention, and declining evacuation was a personal choice that the army had not yet found a satisfactory way to regulate. His fingers were treated with the materials available, which were limited, and the arm wound was cleaned and dressed, and he continued south with the column. 3 days later, the column reached the coast. The evacuation from Hungnam was already underway, the largest American amphibious evacuation since Dunkirk, and Whitfield boarded a transport ship on December 11, 1950, with the rest of his regiment, and sailed south to Pusan. His frostbitten fingers never fully recovered their sensation. The index finger of his right hand retained a permanent numbness that he described in a post-war interview as feeling like wearing a thin glove that you cannot take off. The wound in his arm healed without complication. The concussion resolved over several weeks, though he reported headaches for nearly a year afterward. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on the bridge. The citation described his conduct as displaying conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty, which is the standard language for that citation, and does not fully convey what happened on a damaged bridge in the dark at -28 degrees when a 23-year-old machine shop worker from Youngstown, Ohio, decided to run toward 400 men instead of away from them because he had noticed an irregularity in a firing circuit during a pre-combat inspection and filed it away and retrieved it when he needed it. The Chinese soldiers who fell into the creek when the midpoint section collapsed were recovered by their own forces the following morning. The creek was frozen to a depth of 8 inches in most places, and the collapsed structure had broken through the ice. 11 bodies were recovered from the creek bed during the spring thaw the following year. The bridge itself was rebuilt by Army engineers in February of 1951 and was used continuously for the remainder of the war without significant incident. James Whitfield returned to Korea for a second tour in 1952, assigned as a staff sergeant to a different regiment operating in the western sector near the 38th parallel. He saw combat several more times during that tour, at Outpost Vegas and at a ridge engagement in September of 1952 that cost his company 14 men in a single afternoon. He was not wounded during his second tour. He left the army in 1954 and returned to Youngstown and went back to work in the machine shop where he had worked before his enlistment. He retired from that work in 1987. He died in 2003 at the age of 76. His silver star is in a box in the possession of his daughter in Akron, Ohio. The bridge crossing on the night of December 4, 1950, is not in most histories of the Korean War. It does not appear in the standard accounts of the Chosin Reservoir withdrawal, which focus on the larger actions at Hagaru-ri and Koto-ri and the final breakout to the coast. It is the kind of event that fills the spaces between the named battles that happens every night in a war, that involves men whose names are not attached to famous decisions or famous places, but who do the specific and irreplaceable work of keeping a military force from ceasing to exist. The 31 men who held that bridge for 2.5 hours while a column crossed it behind them, and the one man who stayed on it after everyone else had gone, occupy no particular place in the official memory of that war. They held the bridge. The column crossed. The bridge came down. The war continued.